a decent number of folks have joined, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to the January 20th SIG Multicluster call. And on the agenda today, we have Arthur with continuing the discussion around the MCS cluster selection.
Hi. Okay, I will try to share my screen. One moment. So just like briefly talking about what this is. So we have been trying to discuss about how to do something more advanced in terms of load balancing multi-cluster wise with MCS API. Yeah, last week we go over some like design question and how we want to formulate what we want to achieve basically. And I try to summarize the point that was a bit that we debate, let's say, here. So I know that, for instance, we have been discussing with Laura on Slack about one of the points, and we were kind of agree on that this might not be a blocker, but yeah, basically I resumed everything here and try to lay out the possible options. So for instance, so one of the issue was how do we read the cluster properties from remote clusters? Is it like option one, something implementation dependent, or some other things? For instance, there was Stephen, I think, that proposed including in the service import status, which has some downside of like repeating many info or having some logic to trim that down potentially. I also mentioned to have some maybe creating cluster profile, but there is some downside to it because if you are an MCS API implementation, well, for instance, the MCS API implementation that do not act within like a cloud provider that are not tied to those, it might be a bit weird to have to manage those yourself. And also, it's not even created outside of the hub clusters, and the CRD is not designed for that. However, it doesn't seem to have any technical blocker if you just create a very light cluster profile with just the cluster name and list of cluster properties. So yeah, maybe let's start with that. I don't know if some of you had like more fixed opinion on what this should be, or you simply don't know and don't have preferred option between those, or don't have an extra option to mention. Could be we don't know yet and we'll figure it out.
Yeah, perhaps we could leave it as implementation defined for now, and if something emerges that makes sense to standardize, tackle it
Okay.
then.
Okay, so just that would start. Yeah, I'm kind of for that too. Yeah, I didn't even imagine some kind of thing like that in the first place, but it was a good like remark to do. In another time, something that non-cloud cluster. I'm reading the comment from John. This is cloud automating when possible. Maybe you want to explain? If you have like
Uh,
John.
yeah, so non-cluster cluster creators. Well, so cluster profile is only useful. Well, it's designed for scenarios where there are multiple clusters connected together, and that could be on non-cloud as well. So it's not really about whether it's non-cloud or cloud, it's whether it's a scenario where you're actually trying to use multiple clusters together, and you need some way of representing information about other clusters centrally. So it's something, well, I guess is a fairly natural fit for cloud providers because they tend to have multi-cluster offerings already. In non-cloud scenarios, it would be whatever's providing your multi-cluster integration if there's something actually running. So if you're managing multiple clusters, for example, using uh, GitOps of some kind, where your configuration is all in a repository and you're pushing it out, then cluster profile doesn't really make all that much sense. Well, it wouldn't add any value. You need it where you want something reactive on the clusters. So something like OCM, maybe even for scheduling decisions, for example, with multi-queue, uh, that sort of thing. I'm not sure that answers the question.
Yeah, I just walked into the hallway, having a little bit more less noisy environment. But yeah, it was more of a question because Arthur mentioned that if you are not on a cloud, it is likely that you might not have a cluster profile. And then when you want to use the MCS API, but it depends on the cluster profile for information, then you do get the problem in option 3 as described, where you get the question like who's going to be creating that. Because it is true that if you have a cloud or a distribution that is already doing something multi-cluster for you, then it would be likely that it would also do cluster profile for you. But if you're using MCS API without one of those and you have your own distro or your own cluster, then you would also have to first get your cluster profile configured before you can use the MCS API if it strictly depends on it. On the other hand, Arthur also said, if I remember, since you can do it manually with just a name and a list of properties, then if you need the MCS API, that seems like a super low barrier to have to do. So yeah, maybe it's not that much of a problem. So the who creates part, yeah, in such a case, it would be just the cluster admin doing it, I suppose. And
Mhm.
then it, well, would necessarily be a problem, would be just a task to perform. So I suppose for option 3, that yeah, that might be the most flexible, but also might impose a small requirement on using it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true that it
Yeah. So
can be
it's
created manually. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it could be created manually. So I guess this sort of comes from the caps trying to be very hands-off and specifying as little as possible. Uh, Whereas in practice, uh, it would be easier if we could just say there's an MCS controller and it has to support MCS API and cluster profile and about
Yeah.
API and a bunch of other things. Um, but yeah, even the MCS API, the thought experiment was that in theory, a human operator can do everything that the MCS controller is supposed to be doing, and this is the case here as well.
From that
Yeah.
perspective, having the manual option means that the who creates cluster profile becomes an implementation detail of whoever's implementing the MCS API. So if
Yeah,
for whatever reason it will do it for you, or maybe it's a flag or an optional thing in whatever implementation is going to be doing it, um, then I suppose that would be up to the implementation to document it. On the other hand, it would also be slightly weird to have a specific MCS API implementation try to manage or patch the cluster profile for you, because the cluster profile is technically not just
A
owned
separate
by
API.
MCS API. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, in that way, that would create some interesting loops. But yeah, I suppose MCS API would technically be able to depend on it. But if you do it manually, then you always have that option, especially since the minimal cluster profile is very small. So if someone is at the level where MCS API is what they need, then they will definitely also be at the level where they can just manually create it. And that should, if that is possible, then automation can also do it. So that's a win-win.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you mentioned the fields. That would of course be different because you couldn't really put it in the spec. So how would you know if to create the cluster profile has the right properties? But yeah,
I think it's fine. It just like the fields regarding like maybe the credential provider, or I don't know what it's like. Yeah, credential provider. I think currently there is a pair renaming it, I guess. Would not be populated on every cluster, maybe just only the up cluster. Or if you are creating it everywhere, it's fine, I guess. But yeah, just probably like the name and the cluster property would be required to have it correctly plugged in. I think it's kind of interesting. I'm just not sure if because I'm kind of thinking of my implementation, for instance, and for like Cilium, like we don't directly read the Kubernetes API for like remote clusters. And I think it would be nice to have it kind of already integrated without any manual action. But then if we do this, we might create the cluster profile for them, and it might be overstepping things like if the CNI / multi-cluster networking things does cluster profile creation. I don't know. But it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking along the lines of, say, you draw a parallel to, say, the classic service and ingress problem. If you create a service but you don't create an ingress, you just can't access it. Or the other way around, if you create an ingress but there's no service, then well, you can ingress all you want, but there's no service to go to. And that would essentially be the same here. So if you don't have the cluster profile, that cluster will simply not be part of the MCS API's awareness.
Maybe we could maybe we could do option one, and like if there is some kind of implementation where it would be useful. I'm mostly assuming some cloud, maybe some Mariner, I don't know, because you are using service import to directly importing things. Could be useful for you. No, I'm not sure. Like to propagate the cluster profile between clusters.
Yeah.
It might also be weird to have a network thing propagate cluster profile, though.
Yeah, definitely, because it is a hub object, but it's sort of getting into similar to the composite backend proposal. The idea that maybe we should just have a generic way of exporting objects and making them available across a cluster set, but you get into the scalability issues that happen in option 2 are relevant there as well. If you're copying cluster,
I mean, you are creating one object per cluster in every cluster.
right? But if they get updated a lot,
yeah, sure. Does it though?
well, not for the properties that are of interest to the topic at hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a cluster set wouldn't change zones. or cluster with tombstones, for example.
But you of course get the problem when the cluster profile gets used by something else. And if it just blindly copies or distributes the cluster profile properties, then you do get that problem. And that's of course the risk, because it will at some point you run the risk of having it abused as a generic KV store, which of course always possible. And then you would get broadcast loops and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's why. So when I suggested option 2 the last time, my idea was to take the relevant information from cluster profile or cluster properties and add it to something that gets copied around like service import. So you just have the relevant properties, and you hopefully know what the change expectations and scalability and so on are like for that.
And the benefit of that is, of course, that the MCS API or an unimplementation of the MCS API could be an owner of service import status fields. And then you don't run that multiple owner problem.
Yeah. Well, that's a requirement in the KEP. The MCS controller has to be the owner of the service imports.
Yeah. Since they're only machine writable, that makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, it is also assumed that you only run one MCS controller at a time, which also makes sense. So, yeah.
It's the case because there is no service export class or anything like that, so you cannot run both.
Oh, and even if you would add that later on, then the question becomes, what's the use case for having multiple MCS controllers? Well, maybe in the future when you get like vendored clusters and you need to attach someone else's cluster to your cluster, and they use one MCS API implementation and you use another, and then you get a whole new kind of worms.
Indeed. Interesting. Okay, maybe let's still do option 1, and then option 2 seems not that out of the question with what you just said. But yeah, option 1 and maybe 2 or 3, we'd say, if like someone requires it. So maybe let's go to the next point. This is what we discussed a bit kind of offline on Slack with Laura on the SIG Multicluster. So there was here, like when you select clusters, whatever cluster you are selecting, like whatever level of things, does it needs to be aware of if there is any endpoint that is ready to serve traffic there, or could it send some traffic to a cluster that is not supposed to serve any endpoint and would just like do not answer or something? So my proposal was to say yes, and also Laura suggested this, because it would be a bit broken that, let's say you are selecting some clusters, everything is done, and you are not even able to go to the other preferred clusters. And it might defeat some points here, like the core of what we are doing. And what we might be doing, but I think it's also similar here, so we should probably make sure implementation needs it before doing it. We could add to the cluster status, like we were discussing in option 2 before, to add something like, for instance, a Boolean saying contain at least one endpoint ready or something like that, or all endpoint finished true false, all endpoint terminating true false, something like that. But Laura pointed out something really smart, which is that, well, MCS API implementation should already have some kind of things tracking that, because they are, in fact, servicing multiple clusters, and those who have an opaque view of clusters should kind of already know that some cluster is not supposed to serve any traffic, I think. So, and they didn't need this so far, so I think it kind of makes sense to not do it for the moment. But if some implementation requires it, maybe we can do this. However, I kind of read some thread in Gateway API Lens, I think, or SIG Network, that was saying that endpoint should really be distinct from service from a scalability perspective. Here, it would probably not be like we are only talking about 1 or 2 Boolean, maybe 3. So it shouldn't change that much, I hope. But well, I don't think implementation really needs it because they should already have that kind of info and doesn't need it so far. So to me, it makes sense to not do it right now. Maybe consider it later. I don't know if what I said just makes sense or not, but
A lot of sense, because if you parallelize it back to the cluster profile, in both cases your implementation might not need this awareness at the API level. So if there are no endpoints, or if there are endpoints, just like say cluster IP would behave, the implementation would already know that. Just like in Cilium, if you were to not consume, or in your workloads, or in your selectors, or in your MCS API, you would not necessarily consume the cluster profile directly, but your MCS implementations control plane would do it. That would be the same here. So it would also track that for you. And if the implementation, or at least the spec, so not necessarily in place, but the spec is similar to how a cluster IP would behave, because it also doesn't know necessarily if there's any endpoint available or ready, then that behavior would be the same, and it would just be up to the control plane to make sure that the presented behavior that the control plane of the MCS API implementation presents, that is well, as advertised. It's same with like service mesh or something else. They also abstract or overlay on top of whatever is already there. So you don't necessarily need the underlying base spec to have everything, if the thing on top of it can already coordinate that.
Yeah, it's a bit slightly different though with cluster profile, because cluster profile is arguably not directly network related, and this is more network related. But yes,
that's true. That's true.
Following your point.
Yeah, it also depends on whether you assume as an implementer that all your consumers will only talk to your implementation and not talk to the API server directly. I suppose that it also, just like, if they are currently not using it or don't need it, and maybe we're solving a problem that doesn't exist yet.
Yes, for sure. Brian, you have your and if you want to.
Sorry, I joined a little bit late. Maybe I don't have the context, but the high level question I don't get is cluster for how do we know if there's any working endpoint in a cluster for a certain service? That information doesn't seem to belong to cluster profile. So even implementation wise, it shouldn't be.
It's not cluster profile. It was in service import.
How does it populate into service import? Because the user sets the service export in cluster A and C, right? And then in cluster B, the service import needs to know if the cluster A and C has a endpoint.
Maybe I will really explain, because you are like yeah, we are probably not on the same phase. So the like this point was related to this basically. So does we need to add something at the API level to know if some clusters, if some service exported in a cluster is ready to serve traffic? Like, for instance, are they already equal false? Something like that. And the point here was that implementation probably already knows it, at least the one that have an opaque view of remote clusters, because even without the cluster selectors, they are probably not supposed to send any traffic to a cluster which are not supposed to serve anything. But we might consider adding something to the API if they do really need, but there are some downsides to this. Is it more clear?
So if it is not in the API, in the MCS API, if it doesn't have that information, you say implementation. So it's outside of this API, the implementation itself. I understand if like Cilium Mesh or something, they have their own API to figure that out. I see. Okay. So just to clarify, it has nothing to do with cluster profile, right?
No, nothing to do with cluster profile.
I think that might be my confusion. I just mentioned the cluster profile because just before this topic, we talked about cluster profile a little bit, and I wanted to use that as a parallel on the on whether you might shadow or overlay an API or not, because for the cluster profile, that was a little bit one of the options. But yeah, that's not involved in this thing.
Yeah. And it's, you mentioned Cilium, but in Cilium, we, like, everything is a white box for us. It's not a black box, so it's different. But this is more for implementation that knows about cluster and service exported there, but don't really know necessarily about all the endpoints there. But I mean, with what I just said about that they should already know without this, it should probably be fine and should even might not be in part of this like cap change or something like that. Yeah. So if this seems reasonable to everyone, maybe we can go on the last point. Okay. So the last one, wait, I don't remember it. Let me read. Oh yeah. Sorry. This was about wait. Yes, this was about this, like, where do we make the user write something that says I want to prefer, I don't know, EUS1, or I want to prefer the same region as my current clusters or something. So what I originally proposed was on the service export level, because in fact we don't have any other places. And the advantage to this was that it makes the service like globally consistent, like we used to. Like you make a headless service and it's the oldest and everything is necessarily headless and things like that. It would be a bit similar. And also the traffic distribution fields, existing traffic distribution fields also works like that right now in the service export. But you don't have any way, like when a service import is created, to modify that behavior whatsoever. It might not be a problem because on the service export level, you could say, I want the same region as my current region, or the same, I don't know, team name as the, team name property or anything like that. But you still can't tune it, so it might not be as flexible. Yeah, there was, I think, a lot of debate last week. I don't know what we should do. If we create something else, it would definitely be probably in another CRD, unfortunately. But yeah, I don't know if you have like more firm opinion as last week about something, but if you don't, it's fine, and we'll see later on.
I understand it correctly, one of the concepts is that the service import, or the site on which the service import happens, would still want to be able to do a traffic distribution or something that may or may not be available based on some other selection.
Yeah, for instance, you could have
yeah.
You could have like some kind of service import policy CRD that the user creates, and there you say the service import with the same name. I want my traffic to go to EUS1, for instance. Something like that, probably. Or you say at the service export level, so for every one that import this service, it should go to EUS1. That's probably the two things. I guess both are not even exclusive.
Yeah, because you can imagine that on the service on the export level, you of course don't know what the importer's behavior or desires essentially are. But on the import level, you do know that. So the exporter should only export what is available or what is possible. The importer will be able to make the choices based on what is available. Well, you won't be able to choose something that's not possible. And if something is not possible, well, then the service export should not be exporting it. At least that's I would look at it, but maybe that's too simplistic.
No, that's fine. The only thing is, as well, we hope to have a way to say I want to select clusters with the same property as my current cluster. So this might solve it on the export level, but I mean, still might not be as flexible as we want.
Yeah, perhaps we can start with that.
Flexibility.
Oh. Stephen, you said perhaps we could start with that, right?
Yeah, that's right, and then see if we need something more. Ryan's got his hand up.
Yes. I think John disconnected because of his connection or something. But yeah, Ryan?
Yeah, I think that I'm a little bit, I don't understand. One thing is, even if we want to allow the consumer side to choose, how do we do this? Because it's controlled by the controller, wrote the service import. So how can we even do this?
Probably another CRD.
Or we add another CRD on the...
Probably.
On where? On the... Like, I don't see even there's an option to do that if we follow the MCS one.
We could create like something called service import policy, for instance, where you specify this. It might be a bit weird, since it probably would be the only options that you would put in there. But if we really want to do something like that, we might be able to do it like this.
Okay, yeah, need to think through a bit. I hadn't thought through like how can we even do this. Yeah. Just like I said in the gateway API inference one, that one also didn't really solve it. They kind of just brush it off as an implementation detail. So there's no spec about how to do that. Yeah, here's the same thing. I don't know if there's an easy way to do that, or even proper way to do that. Anyway, when I thought about that, seems weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. So I will, if I will, when I write the cape, I will probably start with like doing it on the service export, because introducing another CRD, etc., just for that might be weird, and it might also break some user assumptions. But we might like revisit this later if someone has a better idea or something.
I dumped something more in the chat because I'm running out of power. I'm also running out of connection, it seems. But yeah, if it needs to be more flexible, then yeah, you need something like a policy. And if you want flexibility, you probably want per namespace flexibility. So you would define your policy in your namespace, for example, and then it would only apply to that namespace. So when you implement something for a namespace sameness, it would only be applying the policy for that namespace. I don't know if that's the direction it was going in. But then the question becomes, is that something that the MCS API would need to specify, or can an implementation do whatever it wants? I mean, that has some benefits, also has some downsides. It's the same with what happened in the service mesh period, where every service mesh made their own CRDs for everything, and then the gateway API came along. So yeah, that might happen here. The question is it something that needs to be dealt before or well, after adoption?
Indeed. You might combine both. Like if you have something on the service export, you prefer that, or maybe you prefer the consumer. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it would be
question.
work out great on both sides. It also kind of depends on what you want to achieve with it, because I can imagine some people want export policies to prevent, say, oopsies or human error from exporting things that you didn't intend to export, especially on shared clusters or clusters where people do manual interaction. And then having some sort of cluster level policy would definitely help. It also means that you can give someone the ability to edit or patch or delete service exports without being able to modify the export policies. So from an access control perspective, that would also be helpful in such a scenario. I don't, or at least the clusters that I interact with, we don't do that sort of thing anymore. But I do know that there are plenty of organizations around the world that do manual cluster, well, artisanal handcrafted cluster configuration. And in such scenarios, that would definitely help. But then again, would you be at the level of MCS API needs if that's what you're doing? I don't know.
Okay.
It also depends on the implementation, because if the implementation itself will have a great way to do export or import policies, then yeah, maybe that would inform a future revision of the MCS API. I don't know. It's there's so many unknowns.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with that first. Okay, cool. So I think as mentioned, yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. So unless someone has something else to say about this, I think it's fine, and we might like start to consider some API. Like we now know approximately what we want, at least at first, and maybe now let's check out some API. Well, not now, but later on. Okay. So thanks everyone. That was really cool. And yeah, thanks for participating to this.
All right. Thanks, Arthur. So there aren't any other topics. And if we had a bit more time, maybe we could have discussed the mailing list thread about what we should do about service imports. But I encourage people to go and look at the mailing list instead, because we've only got about a quarter of an hour left, and I don't think that's enough time. So if nobody else has anything to bring up.
And there is like many folks that answer on the mailings that are not there also.
That too, yeah. So I wish you all a great rest of the week and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.